Hello, everyone, and welcome to my introduction to this week's podcast. This is Amy Irvine. She lives in western Colorado, up near Grand Junction. Her book is Desert Cabal, A New Season in the Wilderness. It was published in 2018 on the 50th anniversary of Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire. And so the trope of the book is that she's out where he was secretly buried near the Mexican border, and she's sitting next to him. She brought him a beer or two, and she brought some harder stuff and coffee for herself, and that she wanted to enter into this dialogue with him, and she wanted to talk with him about a number of subjects. One, his treatment of women. He had 5 wives and 100 million mistresses, and Me Too movement would have a rough time with him. If you can get rid of Garrison Keillor in the Me Too movement and Al Franken in the Me Too movement, and then allow sexual misconduct of appalling magnitude in our time now, and also in someone like Edward Abbey. And so that's one question, but it's not her main question. Another question is, it's a deeper women's question or feminist question, depending on how you want to say it, but a question, an important one, and that is, while you were out pretending to be all alone in the wilderness, you're a white, privileged man who is pretty surely not going to be harassed or molested out there, grown up in a culture where men go to places alone, who has plenty of money and freedom to do this. This is white privilege, white male privilege in the highest sense. While you were doing that, Edward Abbey, your wives were being neglected. You wrote them out of your book. You had these other women that are also not mentioned, at least by name. You were neglecting your children. You were not taking on the responsibilities of what it is to be an adult male, and yet your wives were suffering. There were times when there was a lot of economic hardship, and your children were neglected. And so this has to be some of the picture that, and I think Amy Irvine sees it as also another kind of loss, that he didn't have the joy of a significant, long-term, trusting, flawed, but persevering and loving relationship. So there's that. But she also wants to talk about where things are headed. So I will tell you, you don't need probably to be warned, but she's no friend to the world of Donald Trump. Or the current Congress, or the current Supreme Court for that matter, and is very hard on those because mostly, for many reasons, women's reproductive rights among them, but also for the wilderness, for Grand Staircase Escalante, for Bears Ears, for Arches National Park, for the national park system at large. Anyway, that's a big subject that she wanted to talk about. And so she's really an extraordinary person. She wrote this book. She got death threats. She was denounced, and people shouted at her. People, confronted her on the street because she dared to attack the saint, the sainted Edward Abbey, or as they call him, Ed Abbey. She was willing to take that on. But what I want to emphasize, and then we'll go to the show, is that the book is not really a critique of Edward Abbey. Of course, he comes up in it. She's actually pretty loving and forgiving and respectful of Edward Abbey. The net result of her book is a kind of a certain kind of cautious and footnoted celebration of the life and achievement of Edward Abbey. She's not willing to dismiss him. She's not going to cancel him. And not just because we need all the allies, those people need all the allies they can get, but also because we have to take the whole person theory. And Edward Abbey was not just one thing. He was many different, often contradictory things, fascinating. And he's one of those individuals who has had an outsized influence. I mean, every river runner, every outfitter, every person who loves that world has read at an early time, 16, 17, maybe even younger, early 20s, his Desert Solitaire, and has then become part of kind of a cult of Edward Abbey, because it's kind of a grumpy environmentalist anthem, an attack on consumer capitalism. Abby Hoffman kind of protest flipping off the world. It has some of that in it. It has some, as I've said, it has some toxic masculinity in it. But her book is not really about that. Her book is about her own journey and the fact that we can't tell the story unless there are more voices in it. Not just women, as say a character in one of his novels, not just women that are part of his private life, but women at the table, women out there hiking and camping and spending 3 weeks in the wilderness and having all those experiences themselves, maybe not alone, but in small groups. And one hopes alone, or you want to live in a nation where a woman can go camping alone and feel perfectly safe. Of course, no one ever feels perfectly safe, but you know what I'm saying. So anyway, she's a remarkable person. That's all I can say. And I don't agree with all of her book. What difference does that make? But I found it very useful. Again, it's Desert Cabal. She redefines the word cabal into a much more positive, generous, or gentle conspiracy. Desert Cabal, A New Season in the Wilderness, published in 2018. You can get it in all of the usual ways. So, fascinating. I'm heading to Moab, to relatively her part of the world, soon, because I'm giving a talk as John Wesley Powell, the Civil War explorer, on the 3rd of April. And I'm giving a talk as J. Robert Oppenheimer on the 4th of April. So we've got really good friends, good friends in southwestern Colorado and in Santa Fe and so on. And so I'm so looking forward to all of that. Let us go to the show. Welcome, everyone, to this very special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and I have the enormous pleasure of sitting across, virtually at least, from Amy Irvine, the author of a really fascinating and important book, Desert Cabal, A New Season in the Wilderness. The book was published on the 50th anniversary of the publication of the landmark book by Edward Abbey, Desert Solitaire, and it's structured along the lines of that book, and in some ways it's a sustained conversation, at times debate, with the late Edward Abbey. Amy Irvine is an extraordinary person. She's written for Orion, Outside, Best American Science, and Nature Writing Series, Pacific Standard, Climbing Rock and Ice, and High Country News. You've taught in a number of places. You've won the Ellen Malloy Desert Writers Award and a teaching fellowship. That's an extraordinary career, and of course it's still underway. Welcome.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Really a delight. So I love the book. I've read it twice, and I know there are, protectors of Edward Abbey who can't stand to hear him ever criticized, even in the lightest way. But I don't really see your book as a fundamental criticism of Abbey. I think you dispute some of his approaches. You're wry about some of his behavior and his attitudes, but I don't think you are a net critic of Abbey.
No, not in the least. I'm glad you read it that way, because you're right. A lot of people didn't, at least initially. I think the tide slowly changed over time because the conversation was headed that way anyway. I would say that I liken this to a real gesture of love. I think love is a complicated relationship. It involves a lot of trust and honesty. And Abbey had an enormous influence on my life. In high school in Utah, I'm a sixth-generation Utahn. I was quite confused and torn between sort of the more apostate Ivy League version of my family and the more rural ranching side of the family, and really didn't fit into either one very well at all. And my grades were failing, and I was partying too much, and my history teacher,
Mr. Krenkle.
John Mark Krenkle, he handed me a copy of the Monkey Wrench Gang and a map to the Escalante Canyons and said, "Don't come back until you have something good to say about this place."
He said, "I won't pass you in this course unless you go out there."
He did. He was pretty ruthless. This is a man who came to school board meetings wearing a T-shirt that said, "Hey, Duke lives," and all that kind of fun stuff. Anyway, I took him seriously. And though I'd spent quite a bit of time in southern Utah with my family over the years, I hadn't seen it in the way that Abby had. I sort of believed the lands were my birthright. We could camp anywhere. We could boat on Lake Powell. But Abby really instilled in me this idea that these were sacred places that I could actually fight for, that I actually had a voice in, and that changed the direction of my life considerably. And so, even though there was a brief stint spending a lot of time out there as a dirtbag rock climber, I quickly became bored with that consumption kind of recreational approach to public lands. First of all, I think that the resource never came first. It was mostly about people's ticking off their bucket list and whatnot, myself included. And so at some point, I realized that there was more to do. And that's when I went to work for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. And that felt like coming home to a place I belonged and coming home to a place of understanding how we might relate to these lands. But over time, I became a bit disillusioned. I felt like I was still embroiled in a kind of patriarchy that I'd been bucking against since I was a young girl in the church. And I realized women couldn't hold the priesthood or really any other kind of power. And that the construct of wilderness as defined by Abbey and Muir and wilderness conservation organizations up to that point were still based on this kind of privileged idea of solitude and pleasure and aesthetics. And
The solitude of privileged white males who have the freedom and security to go out into the wilderness.
exactly. And I had, since a young girl, had threats to me in the wilderness. I tell of a story in the book about a man walking into our neighbor's tent and putting a knife to the mother's throat, the whole family in there crying, and my father getting up in his white do-a-fold long underwear, grabbing his loaded pistol from under his gun, which was right next to my head, and walking out, putting on his boots, walking out into the night, and putting the pistol to the man's ribs and leading him out of the tent.
Just one of several experiences you had with predatory or dangerous men in the wilderness.
Very much so, yeah. And I was writing to Abby. I was writing Desert Cabal shortly after Trump was elected. Me Too was in full swing. I was understanding that a lot of these situations I'd been in the wilderness or even in wilderness advocacy were actually still very masculine in their definition and even threatening to my well-being. Increasingly, I was really concerned about the status of Native Americans and the disconnect between the understanding that these were ancestral lands and not just our wilderness playgrounds.
We'll come back to that, but this was, of course, Trump 1 that you're writing about in this book. And you say, for example, on page 41, this man with Agent Orange hair and a napalm personality. So no love lost there. We'll come back to Trump 2, which is even more threatening after a time. But let me go back to this notion of you and Abby. So I was fascinated that since you lived out there and had all of your life been out in those lands, that the first book, Desert Solitaire, was fascinating, of course, but it wasn't particularly important to you because it was kind of ho-hum. That's what you did. But when your teacher handed you the Monkey Wrench Gang, which is sort of like, what are we going to do about the exploitation and extraction of the wilderness? Suddenly, you were radicalized. I love that story.
Yeah, that really lit a fire in me. I think I'd grown up with a sense of disempowerment within the Mormon religion, with a pretty misogynistic family, and having such an alcoholic, sort of very misogynistic kind of father. I chose relationships like that.
Who sleeps with a loaded gun, by the way.
Sleeps with a loaded gun. Just that kind of entitlement and dismissal of my rights and choices that when I got to the Monkey Wrench Gang, and bless Abby for putting Bonnie Abzug in there, because that changed everything, right? There was a woman in there also wreaking havoc on the institutions that were then hell-bent on destroying the land and still are, absolutely, maybe even more so, absolutely more so. I suddenly could see myself in a role that meant something, and it didn't feel fringe. It felt central to protecting what we had that was so misunderstood by so many.
He wrote you in, finally, in Monkey Wrench Gang. And so you find a woman there who embodies some of your views, who speaks to you. It's no longer just Abby's patriarchal world. So I want to ask this question and get it on and off the table. It would be so easy just to cancel Edward Abbey. He's a predatory man. He had innumerable lovers, 5 wives. He cheated on every one of them. Many of these were underage women, including Clark, the last. So there's so many reasons why we could cancel him. He was anti-immigration. He said some awful things about Native Americans, although he's got a mixed record on that. He said terrible things about Mexicans. It would be very easy just to say that was then and this is now. And of course, he had an important influence, but we just got to break with this guy because he's just bad. What do you say?
I want to speak to that in the most present moment right now, in which I think Americans are realizing that they again voted for a man that actually is going to endanger their lives, their livelihood, people they care about. But now they're waking up and thinking, oh my God, what have I done? So in this moment, I think, and Rebecca Solnit has been great about writing about this, how this is not the moment to wag the finger at those people for having been so misguided, but to like call them in rather than to call them out, call them in. We can't afford to cancel anybody. We're complicated creatures. I certainly get called out for being a hypocrite on things all the time. And I own that very much in Desert Cabal. That's part of wrangling with Abby, is owning my own stuff. God knows I've wanted to cancel. I was so disappointed when I heard that Neil Gaiman had such a terrible record with women. And he's just been one of my literary heroes for a long time. I don't even think it's as easy as let's separate the art from the artist. I think we just hold the whole thing in our hearts, as complicated as it is. And we try to move forward together in a better, more humane way.
All right, Amy, I get you, and I'm with you, of course. This is no time to be splitting and subdividing those who are trying to protect Utah and the wilderness from the predatory, extractive community. However, there's a really, I think, really important insight in your book, and it's really struck me this second time through, that you don't want to quarrel with Abbey about women, although you're well aware of the Abbey problem with women. The problem is deeper than that for you, because by doing this, by cutting himself off from genuine, deep, flawed, permanent relationships with a woman, he missed out on the cabal. He was a rugged individualist, and that pose cuts him off from the very community that we need to break bread with and to work together with, for all of our flaws, all of us, to fight the things we don't want to happen to the West. Isn't that what you were trying to argue?
Certainly, and I don't think that's contrary to what I'm saying here. The cabal is the way to go. It's just we have to call the people in that were somewhere out being rugged individualists and invite them to join us, because we're not going to survive this thing if we're all sort of siloed in our own little scared cubicles, as it seems more than anything, because people are so not outside anymore. And certainly as the weather gets worse and people get more frightened and people spend more time online, we're going to become even more siloed. So how here do we engage with people? Well, I live in a really rural area and have most of my adult life that is largely made up increasingly of Trump supporters. I think we might start to see that swing the other way. I'm hearing this already from neighbors, but I've tried to stay, even as I'm critical of certain aspects of the rural West, I also try to engage with it and embrace it. And I will continue to do that, because it's only with those conversations that things will ever have a chance of changing.
Yeah, we need to take a short break. I'm having such a good time talking with Amy Irvine, the author of Desert Cabal, a new season in the wilderness. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm talking to Amy Irvine, who wrote a really extraordinary book, Desert Cabal, a new season in the wilderness. It was issued on the 50th anniversary of the blockbuster book by Edward Abbey, Desert Solitaire. Interestingly, you went to his grave, his unmarked secret grave at the bottom of the country, right on near the Mexican border, and you took some beer for him, and of course, he's dead, but you took some harder stuff for yourself and coffee, and you sat there and engaged in a dialogue with him and invited him to talk with you. Now, of course, the book was written later, but much of it was engendered in that conversation. Why was that important?
You may have missed it also. There's a little prelude at the beginning that's a little esoteric, but it says basically I didn't really go there. And some people got really hung up on that. Like, what do you mean you didn't go there? Then this doesn't count at all. And I was like, enough with these bucket lists, enough with like trying to go somewhere and find something and claim it for yourself. Like, I just wanted to have the imagined conversation. I never set out to find his grave.
Of course, that's an extractive thing in itself.
Exactly. And consumptive and performative and all the things.
And narcissistic, by the way.
Totally. It was amusing to me that people were so miffed that I hadn't really done that as a fet, So that was one reason I got canceled, and as well as, the fact that I dared to speak back to you. I mean, Abbey could say what he wanted, but God forbid a woman would say something to
Amy, for everyone who was upset that you went to his grave, there must have been 100 who said, "Tell me where it is. I want to go myself."
Right, there were. But more importantly, what was striking, I mean, it was a difficult book because I didn't realize that I was so shocked by the backlash. Admittedly, some of it was from a rough draft that some of my mentors and some of the wilderness advocates in the Utah wilderness community saw. And I really was writing in that first draft. I always write very extreme first drafts, but I was so fraught with and in despair about what was happening under the Trump administration and with Me Too and that summer of racial reckoning and everything that was coming our way. And of course, the effects of climate change that were rapidly mounting, especially in the Southwest. And so I was shocked to find out that people in my own quote unquote camp, as well as these Edward Abbey diehards that I didn't necessarily affiliate myself with, were so upset that, I got death threats, I got nasty mail, they showed up at my events. and
what is it? How dare you criticize our hero?
Yeah. It was really interesting. I mean, he's a cult hero for sure. But what was more amazing were the number of people of color, Indigenous people in particular, queer people and women who showed up to say, I've waited my whole life for this book. I love being out in the wilderness, and yet I can't relate to this book. This is not what it's like for me. In fact, it's quite scary out there. I had one woman who stood up at an event and said, years ago, I read Desert Solitaire, and I dropped out of college. I took a semester off, and I drove out west, and I spent 6 months traveling and camping and hiking in Abbey country. And one night, some men came into my camp and beat me to a pulp with rebar, and I barely made it out alive and spent months in the hospital. I'm terribly disfigured and disabled now. And, of course, the whole audience is crying. And she said, that's not the experience I have in the wilderness. Abby's experience is not mine. And that really, it was those stories that helped me get over the shock of the backlash, because I realized there were a lot of people that hadn't spoken out. And of course, very quickly, the tides were changing in terms of recognizing that public lands were ancestral lands, and with the establishment of the Bears Ears in particular as a national monument that had been cut in half by Trump that just 2 years prior to this book coming out, and then were restored by Biden, and now it seems to be a wholesale
the yo-yo effect
fire sale. Although this time I think we're in for something even worse in terms of the public lands being dismantled, maybe in their entirety. So that's another issue. But I think the comparison, and I tried to go toe to toe with Abbey chapter by chapter. So I even used his chapter headings and wrote my own essay as a response, right?
I love that structure about the horse that he tries to rescue, and about rocks, and about cowboys and Indians and water. You follow the basic structure of Desert Solitaire with your own short essays, not necessarily reacting and responding, but completing or improving.
Yeah, I mean, I really just found that I had so much to say in terms of my own experiences on those topics. And I was inspired to to the challenge of writing about each one on my own. And some accuse me of that, of cheating somehow with using that structure, but I quite enjoyed it. And it really, what I learned when I went to respond to his essay about Havasu Canyon and being down there and having this night where he got to quote unquote go native and have this wild night down there, trapped, seemingly trapped and without water. And then I tell my story about going down to Havasu a year after a tourist had been murdered, because the Havasu are under tremendous stress and deprivation, as all the tribes are, but in particular, a few of these Southwest tribes. And
But but Amy, I hate to interrupt. I'm so sorry, but you say something so important in that chapter, because you end by saying, look, of course, Native people have been oppressed and they live in poverty and so on, but they are people too, and there are sexual predators among them, and we shouldn't privilege them and make them sort of noble savages who live in a golden age. And you accuse Abbey of, when he says going native, of a kind of exploitation of Native peoples.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's that sort of tokenism, exoticism, whatever you want to call it, but it excuses the fact, or it misses the fact that it was a Havasupai man who murdered the tourist. But I think it also, clearly that murder happened for different reasons, and
In the
say,
context.
right, yeah, if we're talking about the effects of colonialism, right? Which brings me to the point that I think what so many of the indigenous people of the Americas, the United States in particular, and people of African American heritage are saying to us now that we're also losing rights that so quickly, and they're saying, well, welcome to our world. It's always been like this in the United States for us, and could you please reckon with your own legacy? And I think that's the next book I'm working on, is reckoning with my Mormon ancestors who were women, which are much harder to find because they don't have such glorious romantic stories written about them. And I think their lives were terribly hard. But they, in the ways that they were oppressed as plural wives, all of the women I descend from were plural wives of notorious Mormon men, the very first ones to colonize the Intermountain West. I uncovered some really dark stuff that my family was involved with or adjacent to or profited from, in terms of enslaved African Americans who were brought with Missouri plantation converts, and also in terms of, say, the Bear River Massacre in southeast Idaho, where my mother's family settled shortly after that massacre and basically filled in the spot where the Shoshone used to live. It was my great, 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 great grandfather on that side who cleared the first land, built the first bridge, plowed the first.
Complex. It's a complex history.
Again, I had to thank Abbey, because in Desert Cabal and having this engagement with him, I realized how much more there was for me to do in terms of reckoning with my own legacy here, and the ways that the women in my family were oppressed and were also complicit in the story of the West. It's not nearly as romantic as it's romanticized by, say, the rural cowboy folks, and it's also romanticized by the Edward Abbey folks, and really it's so much more complicated, right?
Yeah, so many things here to talk about. First of all, Abbey gets some credit in my eyes in his second chapter on cowboys and Indians, because he says much of what you just said. When Native people came up to you and said, welcome to our world, he says the cowboy and the Indian, he's using these as very simplistic terms, but they're suffering from the same fate, that they're being overwhelmed by intense capitalist extraction, and that they are also kind of an endangered species. And you're saying that Native people are now saying to us, well, welcome to our world here, right?
Right. Yeah, I think, again, there's so many opportunities here for us I know Elon Musk just called the great sin of the West empathy, but I think empathy is actually our most important aspect, value right now, the most important tool we can pull out of this toolbox and use with one another. And whether it's a cowboy or an Indian, to use Abby's simplistic terms, the oblivious tourist who comes to Moab and rents the razor and goes out and tears up the land and really doesn't know any better, but has a religious experience, so to speak, and maybe can be changed in the ways that I was certainly changed.
When I have most recently been in Moab, it's shocking at how many ATV giant jeeps tear up the countryside purveyors there are. It seems to me to be toxic masculinity in another way. You're saying that even that crowd is capable of spiritual experience out there as they're roaring around.
Well, I sure hope so, or we're doomed, aren't we? What I want to say about that is that I think this toxic masculinity is running rampant. It's epidemic because these guys feel disenfranchised. They feel threatened by this rise of other identities and other entitlements and other ways of being in the world.
Women's sensibilities, one reason for
Right.
the intense reaction to your book.
Right. And of course, now we're seeing with the loss of Roe v. Wade and everything else. I mean, there were people at the time that Desert Cabal came out who said, I think you're being a little extreme here. And I said, we are under attack, you guys. Like, women's rights are going to go like that if Trump stays around. But I want to just stick with the empathy piece here because it's really easy for me to trash these guys. And I want to say that I think they're suffering as much as anybody. And the proof is in the number of suicides in that group, for one thing, especially in rural areas and especially with guns. And then, of course, we have the incredible amount of fentanyl and meth and, the opioids that also plague that group. So it says to me that that this whole masculine privilege thing that they've got going, and the big noisy all the guns and the big rigs that can drive anywhere and do anything, it's not working for them either. There's a lot of misery there. I still go into the hardware store or the local saloon here for a burger, and those guys open the door for me. They say hello. We have conversations. One of them just helped me move my stuff from one place to another. And we talked the whole way about immigration. The news he was getting from Fox was very different from the news that I'm getting. He really didn't believe that Trump would ever be able to deport the kind of people that he's deporting or go after them the way they're being gone after. And now it's happening. So I'm interested to check back in with him and see what he thinks. But I'm not going to give up because we have no other recourse. And I have only ever known, as a woman who descends from women who actually, ironically, could go to Brigham Young and say, I want a divorce. I'm really not happy with my husband who's never around. He likes his other wives better than me, and I can't even get a sack of flour from him, as was the case with my great-great-great-grandmother. Brigham Young granted them divorces freely, and in the Victorian age, that was unheard of, right? So I'd like to think that's my epigenetics because I too have had several unsuccessful marriages. And I think that it's because I just keep bucking against this particular kind of masculine construct. But I also see that the men that I've been involved with are really struggling with it.
I want to come back to Abby for a moment. So at one point, there's some rage. Well, there's quite a bit of rage in your book. And you say, look, Abby says, this is life. This is what everybody should be doing. You go out, you're independent, you're alone, you drive to the middle of nowhere, you park the car, you hike as long as you want. It's great. And you're saying, yeah, because you're not watching your children, are you? I'm taking my daughter to the emergency room. I'm making sure that she gets through whatever episode she's in. I'm making sure she has food. And, when you read about Abbey, and I've read extensively by him and about him, including his extraordinary journals, he not only neglects his wives, he neglects his children. He always has the next woman in the wings or several before he manages to explain to the current wife that he's leaving her. He is the very epitome of the absentee father, sowing his seeds around the American West in all sorts of ways, but not taking even minimal responsibility for the lives of these women and children. And that seems like it's like a fundamental crime. It's worse than womanizing. It's the deep irresponsibility of not taking care of those that you've created.
Indeed. He would have made a fantastic early Mormon polygamist. Because, there's a letter that William Hartley, who was a BYU historian and wrote a 700-page biography about my great-great-great-grandfather, Howard Egan, who was one of the very first, helped blaze the first trip across the continent from winter quarters to Utah.
Right.
He was there when Brigham Young said, "This is the place." And he went on to do all kinds of extraordinary things, drive one of the very earliest large cattle herds to California to feed miners. He blazed that trail. He ran that stretch of the Pony Express through the Great Basin west of Salt Lake. He set the record crossing the West Desert by mule. He also, when he was in California selling the cattle off, he came back, and his favorite wife, he presented him with a child that wasn't his. And he promptly rode out and tracked down the man who had fathered the child and shot him in the face and took off his hat and said, "Gentlemen, I have killed the seducer of my wife, and vengeance is sweet." And an all-Mormon jury acquitted him in 25 minutes.
The ultimate patriarchal moment.
Completely justified. He could do whatever, but he was so grossly negligent of my great-great-great-grandmother, who had to beseech Brigham Young to write a letter. And that letter that William Hartley discovered said, "For the love of God, could you at least take your wife and her 2 daughters, one of them being my great-great-grandmother, a sack of flour and firewood to survive?" They were literally living like animals. So yeah, I think about that a lot. And the more I learn about how impoverished some of the Mormon women were, especially the ones I descend from, I think, wow, Abby, you fit right into this.
You say on page 24 of your book, quoting now, "But that's the rub. You guys have always waxed lyrical about the isolation, the independence, but the truth is you couldn't handle the wide open between organisms, the sparseness of desert society. You were always seeking much closer, more carnal companions." And this, I'll tell you, I'm pretty forgiving of Abbey. He is what he is, etc. But he writes Desert Solitaire. He's this lonely man who goes out alone and braves the wilderness. And even though it's a little desolate at times, it fulfills him in the biggest possible way. He doesn't mention that he's married. In fact, he leaves his trailer at Arches National Monument to go see the birth of his first child. And for him to write his first wife out of the book is one thing. That's a literary decision, a strategy, I suppose. But the word solitaire becomes really upsetting to me because he wasn't solitaire. He was finding women. And he probably was alone a few times, but in the second year, and remember, 2 years are collapsed into one, his wife is with him, and he never mentions that.
Yeah, I have a hard time forgiving him for that. I think it's just another form of erasure, right?
Yeah, we have to take a break, but it's more than that to me, Amy, because think of the number of men, and women too, but mostly men, who've been completely inspired by this trope of the solitary individual in the small trailer with the mice running around and the snake at the door and so on. And they think that's the ideal, that's the romance of the American West. And it turns out it wasn't true, that he needed carnality, serial carnality, had terrible commitment problems, but he didn't want to be out there alone, and when he was alone, he soon found a way to go to town. All right, we need to take a break. I'm talking with Amy Irvine. It's so much fun. I'm really having a great time talking with you. I can't wait one of these days to meet you. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm talking to Amy Irvine, Desert Cabal, new season. Well, it's a short book, so I read it yesterday to get ready for this interview. I'd read it before, and it's not that long, so it's about 100 pages, a little bit less. So it's an afternoon or evening read, and I heartily recommend it. It seems to me it should be paired with Desert Solitaire, and the same is true of Jack Kerouac. So I'm a big fan of Kerouac. Some of the same issues, of course, especially for Neal Cassady. And I found about a year ago Carolyn Cassady's memoir, and I thought, this is going to be one of those awful, weeping, left behind wives' memoirs. It's fabulous. And it's an incredible commentary on the Beat generation and on Cassady and on Kerouac. It should be paired always in college courses or elsewhere with On the Road, just as I think your book, for all the hate mail and the death threats, should be paired with Abbey's Desert Solitaire. It seems to me that that's a more complete picture. It's also a generational picture, because you will grant that even though there are lots of toxic males around today in Utah and everywhere, and they're now getting kerosene poured on them by this current administration that says it's just fine, it's about time that you reassert your toxic masculinity. Even though that's true, Abbey's a generation ago, almost two, and so there have been some significant changes in the social fabric, don't you say?
I think so on one hand, but again, to come back to the fall of Roe v. Wade,
Yeah.
and I'm not so sure we've made significant gains, and I'm frustrated that I didn't hear more from the more quote unquote progressive males who could have been making a lot more noise about reproductive rights when they were about to fall. And it seemed like the work largely fell to women, as these things do. I'd like to say that we've made a lot of progress, and I love teaching. I was a visiting writer for the environmental studies program at University of Montana last winter, and I had a graduate seminar full of kids that really couldn't relate to Abbey at all because of the generational changes. I think we have made some significant gains, and that's probably part of the large reason for the backlash, right? Elon Musk is threatened by his child who's trans, so therefore they're going to take down the entire trans reality in this country. It's a tricky moment. I want to say we've made so much progress that that's why we have such an enormous backlash happening. But I wonder when something like Roe v. Wade can fall so quickly.
So interesting, though, isn't it, that, today women are well more than half of all law students. We have lots of women in Congress compared to a generation or two ago. College students are majority women, not men. Men are falling behind in all sorts of very important metrics. They are falling behind, and this is kind of a I'm channeling my inner Susan Faludi here, but instead of looking in the mirror of these men and saying, oh, he'd better wake up and become more complete and seek out real community and break bread with people that we don't necessarily like that much, we should maybe attempt some spiritual growth here. Instead, they're like, let's just backlash. Let's just try to throw the thing right back in the bottle and return to Ozzie and Harriet, where men were men and women weren't in colleges and weren't on the Supreme Court and weren't presidents of universities. We're not going back, right? Or trying.
Well, I mean, look how fast things changed in Iran. Women went from being lawyers and doctors to being covered up and kept at home.
You don't think that can happen here? You don't think that we could have a Shia kind of government?
I didn't ever think that reproductive rights would be made so criminal that you could receive a life sentence, and now it's even being proposed, the death penalty, or, like the extreme of the penalties for asserting your reproductive rights or helping somebody with reproductive rights is, I never thought in a million years that would happen here. I never thought that people I knew would be radicalized in a way that they have been, due largely to isolation and too much time on the internet, I think.
Amy, in reading your book, again, I saw this chapter, Polemic Industrial Tourism, and you then go into a brief outline of global climate changes and their effect on the planet and on ecosystems, on native communities, on all of us. It's a short list, but it's pretty strong, and we'll go back to that in a moment. But you also are sort of saying to Abbey, hey, need to give you a few little things you didn't really know were coming. You were scared of Cadillacs in Arches National Park. You were scared of the uranium industry. Wake up, buddy. We're now talking about the possible death of the planet, or at least the extinction of humanity on the planet. That's really chilling. I mean, he had a lot of insights about American industrial culture, but he didn't see this coming.
No. And even, John Muir did. He was a big student of the glaciers and loved them so much, loved the ice. And he noticed early on that the planet was warming and that the glaciers were melting and that would spell huge danger for the planet. I think he had a more global understanding of how this all fit together than Abbey did. But again, Abbey was in such a privileged position here in this national park, right, in this sort of idyllic landscape.
We're going to run out of time. I want to turn to the issue. So in your book, which was published quite a while ago now, 2018, you talk about Trump 1.0 and how scary it was and how he did all sorts of extraordinary things like pledge to allow more carbon extraction, including possibly in national parks, to reduce or eliminate the size of national monuments, to cut the staff, cut protections, to refuse to allow the words global climate change to appear in government documents, etc., etc. That was Trump 1.0. And now when I read it again yesterday, I thought, well, I can't wait to hear Amy on Trump 2.1. How this is much, much bolder, more focused, more purposeful, and he's got a Republican majority in both houses.
Yeah, and he's got the courts, or at least the Supreme Court. The other courts are holding their own for the moment, but he's disregarding their orders. So, but you know, this is classic authoritarianism. It's happening all over the world. People are scared. Big money has taken so much meaning from people's lives. And again, to come back to the cabal and a sense of communion with one another and the places we live is probably our best chance for resistance. And to live well in spite of the horrors that are happening, and to form alliances where there haven't been any, and yeah, to come back into relationship to the things that matter.
Yeah, I love that. Of course, we're a nation of 340 million people, and we're talking about spots, islands of enlightenment in private lives, in small communities, and voluntary associations, and so on, in a sea of crazy consumerism. But I want people to understand how this works. So under the Antiquities Act, the president has the power to designate by executive order alone a national monument. Theodore Roosevelt did the first, in fact, the first 18, beginning with his beloved Devil's Tower. This is a really important power that presidents have, and it's been used amazingly. Almost every president has used the National Antiquities and Monuments Act since Theodore Roosevelt. We're in a new era now, so Bears Ears is designated. Trump is elected. He greatly reduces the size of Bears Ears. That creates chaos in administration, in maps, in public understanding, in resource protection. He loses to Joe Biden. Biden does some of the restoration of Bears Ears, and more would have come if he had had a second term or someone like him. Donald Trump is reelected, the second president ever to have that happen after Grover Cleveland, and now he's bent on a much more severe assault on the national monuments, and is probably going to get away with a fair amount of it, depending on how it plays out in the courts. That is new, this yo-yo effect. There's always been local backlash to national monuments, this yo-yo effect where we just don't know what Bears Ears is going to look like, if it exists at all 2 years from now.
That's right. And, you know, it's unique in that it's managed in partnership with the 5 tribes to whom those lands are sacred and ancestral. You know, now we have a president wondering if Native Americans even have real, quote unquote, citizenship. So to begin the degradation of their birthrights here, I think we know where this is going. And again, if you look at Roe v. Wade and some of the things we thought would never happen here in America and are happening, I think we should be surprised at nothing. What's not happening in the media, and I'm so disappointed in them, is there's not enough of reporting on the amazing acts of resistance that are happening across the country in every form and fashion, and that they're working. You know, Tesla stock was down to 48%. Unfortunately, the Congress and the Senate aren't listening at all, and I don't understand. I mean, they're going to be fired. This is the executive branch is looking to have all the power, and Congress will be rendered so I guess they're on board for that. And handing the country over to Putin, I don't really know I don't know, but I know that they won't be done until they've burned it all down or taken it all for themselves. And knowing that we're talking about this, I'm wondering if these are the kinds of things that we're going to throw you in jail, these kinds of conversations.
A conversation like this, I mean, you actually can posit the notion that in your lifetime, a bold statement about something like this could cause you to have legal jeopardies. You really believe that?
I do. I think we have an executive branch that's not really honoring citizens' rights or the Constitution or federal court orders. So, a- and you know, if they're so admiring of other authoritarian regimes, all that stuff is possible. And I think, you know, most Americans don't know this. I mean, only half of them voted in the last election, and I am amazed at the people I talk to on a daily basis who aren't aware of what's happening because they don't watch the news, or they watch a news that's not really delivering any kinds of facts.
I talked with a former park ranger who spent 30 and more years in the national park system, including at the very highest levels. And he said the recreation industry and agriculture, ranching and farming, mining, chambers of commerce are not going to let the Trump administration get away with the privatization plan, because this is almost $1 trillion of economic activity per year in the United States. Utah is deeply addicted to recreational tourist dollars, that there are too many constituents who want to keep the public lands, including, amazingly, Ryan Zinke of Montana, that he doesn't think that the Trump administration will be able to do this, that there will be such a pushback to Congress that even a friendly Congress will say, no, not so much. What do you think?
The great thing about authoritarian regimes is they always fall, right? They always fall, and the people always at some point get fed up with it. And it's going to be painful, but we will push back, hopefully sooner than later, before the damage is too great. But I agree that generally, once people realize how much is at stake and that their constituents aren't buying it, we're going to see a shift.
So you have a big book you're trying to finish, and you've been at it for a long time. Is it going to be a book that's going to speak to me in the ways that we're talking about? Because one of the things I notice about Desert Cabal is that people get tripped up on Edward Abbey, but that's not really what you're doing in the book. You're talking about kind of an organic movement to localize and build community and build good lives and trusting relationships both with each other and with the land. And this includes indigenous peoples who are going to be at the table now. That's the message of your book. And people are saying, oh, she's too hard on Abbey, or she's too this or that. Is the next book going to speak to people that need to hear your voice?
Well, the book picks up where my first memoir, Trespass, Living at the Edge of the Promised Land, left off, which is with this new baby who was born the night that my mother's mother died. And I had pretty disconnected, what do they call it, insecure attachment from my mother. I think because I come from a legacy of women that weren't able to attach securely to their children because they were under such duress. And I'm exploring sort of the legacy of that, and how, despite the night my daughter being born, I did everything differently than my mother did. I didn't get knocked out with the anesthesia and the amnesia type medications. I didn't. And yet, when that beautiful baby was put in my arms, I was gone. And I had undiagnosed postpartum depression for a long time, which I think is as much due to cultural, societal forces as much as it was me, and also for, you know, a familial legacy. So the question I'm asking in the book with that beginning is like, what stories have been handed down? What stories do we carry literally in our bodies that aren't being reckoned with in the way that, say, Black and brown people in the United States have had to reckon with the legacy they've inherited? There's good and bad in that. I can say I have these resilient Mormon mothers that I come from that were free to divorce when the relationship didn't work well, but also lived in a state of deep deprivation and persecution and oppression. Also, these things that I'm finding out about my family, like what they were complicit in and their part in colonizing the West. How do you find out what your family story is? How do you look at how the wealth and the land that have been acquired, you know, how did your family come by that? How did your community, your people come by that? And what were the costs? Because it's not just the work of the people that we used to build our wealth. It's not just the work of the people that we displaced to gain our wealth. There's also sort of the trauma of descending from perpetrators, the dark stories that we carry that harm us as well. And I firmly believe that my family story is an example of people that are still carrying a legacy that they're burdened by. And I think the larger story here is, I think, how much of this incredible conflict and lostness and even insanity that we see happening in the country is because we haven't reckoned with this past legacy.
One of my favorite sentences in your book is, even no matter how they get there, quote, visitors are shaken to the core by the profundity of absolute quiet. So do you find at this point in your life, the wilderness, the desert, the untrammeled spaces healing?
Absolutely. Still, they're harder to get to. It's harder to find the quiet. You know, you have to dodge the drones and the ATVs and people that are just on their way to the top to take the selfie and get back down for dinner. But I still think that we are, you know, we evolved for 2 million years with a particular kind of brain that was in sync with a particular environment, which was the last ice age, the hunter-gatherer brain that was so stable. That brain has not yet caught up with all the ways that it's being asked to function in the world. And when we get out there, we remember, like, the brain settles into its normal state, and suddenly the world makes sense again, and suddenly we can hear our own needs. And I have actually thought that it's never been as important as it is now.
Then you go out there, you get back into your own body, you get back into your own soul, you look around, and the infinity in every direction makes you realize where you stand in the universe, and that equally interesting, maybe better people have been here before and have found a way to do this without the internal combustion engine. You learn all, and then you hear voices of creatures that scare you a little but also thrill you. The night when the dusk finally comes and you hear your first coyote, it's magic, and you have to be alone or with somebody with whom you can be alone. I've so enjoyed this. I can't wait to read your next book. Thank you for all of this. Some of our listeners will be bewildered by this, and some will hate it, of course, but that comes with the territory. I'm talking with Amy Irvine, Desert Cabal, A New Season in the Wilderness. Thank you so very much.
It's been a great pleasure, Clay. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.